Okay, my AP Literature friends, so the exam has been released, and I have a tradition. I've been teaching AP Literature for 21 years now, and the day or the day after that the exams are released, I ask my students to make a writing workshop for my incoming students in the fall. So what I did today was we went through FRQ 1, which is Alice Cary's Autumn, and I had my students just write for like 50 minutes, just had them write, demonstrating for my students that I'm going to inherit in the fall what the exam looks like in May. What do my templates look like in May? How should they be executed? So what I'm going to do in this writing workshop is show you a bunch of models and exemplars that my current AP Literature students wrote a couple of days after the exam, and this is exactly how they tackled things in May. So without further ado, I'll show you the prompt. In Alice Cary's poem Autumn, published in 1874, the speaker contemplates the onset of autumn. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Cary uses literary elements and techniques to convey the speaker's complex response to the changing seasons. Well, all right, that's perfectly doable. That makes pretty good sense, but we have a question immediately out of the gates. So, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that I have two templates for the introductory paragraph, the declarative and the inverted. And I also teach AP Lang and have done so for over 20 years. And the declarative and the inverted work very well for argument, synthesis, persuasion, and research. And it's kind of a 50-50 coin flip. For rhetorical analysis, my students will always declare, but for FRQ1 and FRQ2 for the AP Literature exam, my students always invert the thesis. And what I'll do is I'll show you 4 examples that my students wrote today, in which I feel they did a fairly decent job manipulating my template of the inverted thesis. Their read of the poem might not be perfectly perfect, but you can get a sense of how to manipulate the template. With that said, one of the things that I always tell my teachers when I work with them, whether I'm at the National Writing Project or just making these YouTube videos, is that you gotta Bob Ross your instruction. There is a huge fundamental difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. To get my students to do this in May, come exam time, I had to get to the proverbial canvas and easel all year long and literally paint endless, countless introductions and body paragraphs and conclusion paragraphs with my students until they could do it on their own like you're seeing now. So the cool thing about Bob Ross is that he likewise only used one, he called it a heuristic, and it's called the wet on wet technique. And my students know that they have a few templates they can use. They can invert, they can declare, and they can tackle the body paragraph syllogistically. So that's what we're going to see in this writing workshop. Now, there's a kind of a cheat code or a hack in reading prompts that I always tell my students. If you go back to the 1970s and look at these poetry prompts, implicit in the language of the prompt are 2 questions. What is the authorial intent? And how does the author construct meaning? As long as students are correctly answering both of these questions, they undoubtedly all day long are going to get the thesis point. And when we invert, what I have them do is this. I have them take 3 sentences to answer what is the author's intent, and 1 sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So let's take a look at that visually. The inverted thesis kind of is like an upside down triangle. And here's what I have my students do. I have them end with the thesis. In the declarative thesis template, they begin with the thesis. And I typically don't like the declarative for literary analysis because what I find is that students will invariably switch the expository mode and do plot synopsis. They'll do plot analysis. And they tend to get very, very regurgitative when they write. They tend just to retell the story of the poem. So by ending with the thesis, it's kind of a gimmicky way to ensure that they stick to the demand of the assignment and that they perform literary analysis from top to bottom. So they're going to end with the thesis. So first 3 sentences are going to get to the authorial intent, and that's just a little bit of context and background. Again, you don't want to retell the story. And the last sentence is going to be, how does the author construct meaning? Whenever you get to the construction of meaning, that's your thesis. So 3 plus 1, always. Now, there's some other things that go into this. And throughout the academic year, I run something called a Word Study Academy, and I teach my students a ton of Tier 2 level vocabulary. And by Tier 2, I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber word. And you'll see that over the course of the year, my students augmented their vocabularies quite nicely. But the thing with teaching Tier 2 level vocabulary is that with some students, you have to disabuse them of the notion that using $1 million words is the equivalent of good writing. So you're going to see in the 4 examples that I have here for the introductions that my students stay in their wheelhouse, they stay in their lane, and they have a nice natural academic tone, right? I always tell my students, be your academic best. And then the other thing that you'll see my students do is manipulate their syntax for the purposes of achieving voice, rhythm, and flow. Out of the gate, I want my students in contention for the sophistication point. And what we do is something called a nuance academy in my classroom, and I have extensive training on this in my National Writing Project courses. Strunk and White wrote a book, seminal text called Write It Right. And in it, they make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. They refer to that as rule number 18. So my students are very well versed in sentence constructs, and they know the purpose of sentence constructs. So you're going to see them, pull some syntactical tricks in these introductions that are pretty neat. And then the kicker, always, 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 no matter what the expository mode is, or regardless of the FRQ, an introductory paragraph is going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So each of the introductory paragraphs that my students write on the AP Literature exam, same for Lang, is 4 sentences long. So just to recap here, what we're going to see is 3 plus 1. 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. So let's take a look at the very first example here that my student wrote. And again, they're going to follow the 3 plus 1. You might not necessarily agree with the read, but you're going to see that they're following this 3 plus 1 template to absolutely ensure that they have the thesis point, and then pay attention to their sentence constructs and their Tier 2 level vocabulary. It's pretty nice. So here it is from the top. In many regards, the changing of seasons is analogous to one's progression through the stages of life. And that's kind of like the Jesus moment there. That's the whole poem, right? So that's what I want my students to do right out of the gate. Just express the exigence of the poem. But there is a simple truth to life. If one stays stuck in the past season or fixated on seasons to come, they invariably miss the present moment, even if that moment just so happens to be a turning point. Life is cyclic in that there are majestic beginnings and inevitable endings, but one is much happier if they can dance with change and embrace its natural ways. Alice Cary highlights this theme in her poem, Autumn, through the personification of the seasons and the inherent juxtaposition between these seasons and the human condition. So you can see in the last sentence, this is where I want my students dropping their terms, their devices, their techniques. So this student is going to talk about the personification, which is very evident in the poem, and then the juxtaposition between the seasons and the human condition. So I tell my students, focus on the 1 or 2 most salient terms, devices, techniques in the poem, and anchor those devices as your thesis statement. The first 3 sentences are just the context and the background with regards to the authorial intent. You can see some pretty interesting syntactical choices along the way, and the vocab is up without overdoing it. So that's that in a nutshell, 3 plus 1. Let's do that again. Let's see another one from the top. So this is a different student, and they're going to do the exact 3 plus 1 paradigm. It's human nature to be resistant to change, especially when such turning points mark an end to the light of life. In spite of this, however, nature marches on regardless and gives to every time and season its own unique beauty, whether it be like literal changes such as from summer to fall, or the consideration that the progression from cradle to grave also knows its seasons. Even though the human tendency is to resist change, when one gives themselves over to the sheer beauty and harmony of it all, the inner peace of letting go can be rather liberating. So we're at the fourth sentence, and we're going to get the construction of meaning sentence. Alice Cary arrives at such a place in her poem Autumn through the personification of the seasons and the juxtaposition between the natural cycles of human existence and the cycles of nature. So yet again, it's very cut and dry. 3 + 1, vocab up, focus on those sentence structures, and just follow the template from top to bottom. It's always 3 + 1. So really what you're going to see here just after 2 examples is that it comes down to the kid's ability to read and ascertain meaning. So my kids struggled with this poem, in all honesty. Despite all the poetry that we did this year, kids came back a little defeated, some of them, and said that was a really hard poem. And I agree, it's dense. There's some trickeration to that for sure. So for my students, I think their scores are going to be contingent upon how well they read this poem, not necessarily how they wrote it, because I think that I train them to be pretty good writers by pulling the strings of these templates. So let's see it again. Yes, you can. You can do this. So if you read it correctly, you absolutely can write it smashingly. So here's the third one. The season of autumn comes with its expected sadness, because this turn of fate invariably reminds one that they too will one day progress into eternal darkness. But in knowing that man shares this cyclic bond with nature, most people do not morbidly obsess over the fact that all life has an expiration date. Now again, we're at the fourth sentence here. Alice Cary's narrator is one such character in that as long as there's the spark of life, so is there hope that one day spring will return to restore all of its original beauty. And I really like this because that's a classic 3 + 1. They nicely got to the author's intent. It's a very good read, very close read of the poem. They got the exigence of it. They got the gist of it. And they also focus on the salient terms, devices, techniques in that final culminating sentence, which happens to be the thesis statement. And as promised, I told you that I would show you 4 of these. So these were the 4 best out of my classroom today. And the fourth one reads as such. As summer transitions into autumn, nature seems to remind man of a certain truth. Death is inevitable. In fact, these seasons so closely mirror the natural life cycle of man that man cannot escape this singular and cyclic fate and knowingness. But in spite of this, man has a choice. Accept the passage of time and be at one with it, or resist and lose the battle no matter how valiant the effort. So again, we're 3 sentences in, the clear articulation of the authorial intent. Now we need to state the construction of meaning. And this student went a little different than the previous 3, but it's still pretty stellar nonetheless. Alice Cary highlights these themes in her poem Autumn through light and dark imagery and the personification of the seasons. I really like that this student focused on light and dark imagery, because I did a unit on roadkill poetry that is also in my YouTube channel. And a lot of those roadkill poems had light and dark contrast in terms of the binary or the juxtaposition. And a number of my students came back and said that they were able to pick that up in this poem. So at this stage of the game, if you're running a writing workshop on your own with your students and they're writing their own introductions, I'd pause the video here and just see how they do on their own. They've seen it 4 times. Maybe you want to write a couple of exemplars and models with them to further unpack it. But I would pause the video here, have them write, and then maybe you could get a couple of students to volunteer what they've written, and you could project it on your overhead and see how they're doing with my inverted thesis template, and kind of grade them on the spot and critique and edit on the spot. So our next natural question is this. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And for those that are familiar with my work, you know that my students always rock out with the syllogistic method, no matter the expository mode. So for rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, lit analysis, research, my students uniformly approach their body paragraphs with the syllogistic method. So for those that are new to my work, let me give a quick fly-by-night overview of the syllogistic method so that you have a working understanding of it. If you want to take a deeper dive into my lessons on inductive and deductive reasoning and kind of the historical overview of the syllogistic method, just go traipsing through my YouTube channel, and there's plenty of stuff that I've recorded over the years on this. So the quick rundown of the syllogistic method is this. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they'd often throw out these big, juicy questions, the essential questions like, what is justice? And you might be familiar with that question from Plato's Republic. And these great scholars, these great philosophical think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of justice. And then the other scholars and philosophers would gather around and find the bullet holes in each definition. And ultimately, just to say that a term like justice is subjective and therefore ineffable, and you're not able to define it objectively. But Aristotle noted this, and we as composition instructors note this. Some students are better than others at oration. Some students are better than others at composition. And he said, how do I get my meh and my not so good students to orate and argue like my top students? And then one day he had a eureka moment. He said, aha, I got it. I opened up the lid of my really good students, and what they're doing is thinking syllogistically. There's like a mathematical computative approach to their line of reasoning. And this ties in perfectly to what we're doing with composition, because we're always concerned about line of reasoning in the body paragraphs. And all a syllogism is a tight little mathematical formula in which a student will argue from premise to conclusion. So here's an example. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. You know, I might say that, and you and your students would say, yeah, Christian, you're right, arsenic is deadly. But then if I say second premise, my dog ate arsenic, we're going to naturally conclude, uh-oh, that's not so good for your dog. Your dog might die, right? So that's just being cogent, and that was one of Aristotle's words, cogency. I use that a lot with my students, and I know a lot of you guys talk about line of reasoning. I talk in terms of cogency and line of reasoning. So I want my students to be very logical, very bulletproof in their arguments from top to bottom. So how do we take Aristotle's template and turn it into a template to perform literary analysis? Here it is. First premise, you're going to make an argument containing terms, devices, techniques. The first premise is always, and again, regardless of the expository mode, it's always going to be 3 sentences long. So on FRQ 1 on the Lang exam, the College Board states a couple of times, your argument must be central, and I wish they would say it on all of the FRQs, all 6 of them, because even in lit analysis, we are arguing. So to keep that argument central, I like for my students to take 3 sentences to get anchored in their literary argument. So no quotes, no paraphrasing, no nothing in that first premise except a literary argument. The second premise is going to come in the form of textual support. I like it when my students kind of teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. Don't do one so much more at the expense of the other. And then the conclusion of the body paragraph. So you got to keep in mind, body paragraphs have conclusions too. Otherwise, you just can't run like hell when you're in the middle of your writing. You gotta wrap it up. So this is where the textual analysis comes, and it's the links, the echoes back to the prompt and the promise of the first premise. So let me show you an example of a first premise that I liked from today. And there are sentence stems that you can steal for your students. And my students often begin their body paragraphs, their first body paragraph, with right from the onset. So pretty much uniformly, my students will begin that way. And there's a reason. Students often ask, where do I begin? And I say, start where the author starts. Have a chronology, have a sequence, be methodic. So to cue the reader into knowing that they're very logical and very well ordered, that they have a chronology, that they have a sequence, my students trigger that acknowledgement with that clause right from the onset. So steal that if you want. So look where my student goes from here. Right from the onset, Cary connects nature's cyclic course to the idea that man likewise undergoes similar phases of change by correlating the season's darkness to death. Perfect, right? So we got our terms, our devices, techniques. You can imply it or you can be explicit. She also suggests that it is human tendency to want to resist the inevitability of such changes from light, signifying life, to dark. In personifying each of the 4 seasons, Cary furthers the idea that the human condition is inextricably linked to the very same fate of all of life. So one of the things that we talk about in my class a lot is the idea of keeping the promise of the first premise. If we break this down, basically the connection, you could call it a binary, a juxtaposition. There's a focus on theme and personification here. So you got the juxtaposition, the theme, and the personification that are promised here. All right. So let's break this down even simpler. So first premise, 3 sentences, literary argument. Now, what I do here when I write is I go quote hunting. And I know that I'm going to need quotes for the juxtaposition. I'm going to need quotes for the personification, and then just some quotes to hammer home the theme. So like the pregnant quotes to hammer home the main thematic concepts. So I usually pause right here, look at my annotations, and make sure that everything's lined up. And that's what my students do too. So in terms of talking about line of reasoning, we have to talk about the promise of the first premise. If we're not talking about juxtaposition, theme, and personification, we're not going to have a clearly articulated line of reasoning. So all the quotes and or paraphrases need to be germane to personification, theme, juxtaposition. So on this slide right here, I start the 4th sentence. All right, the student starts with the 4th sentence, which is the transition into the second premise. Here's another sentence stem. My students always say immediately or something closely akin to that. So right from the onset in the first premise and then immediately in the second premise. It ties back to right from the onset, right? So we know that we're going to need a quote and or paraphrase for that juxtaposition. So 4th sentence, my students typically quote. And they quote the first term device technique that they drop in the first premise. So look what this student does. Immediately drawn upon the juxtaposition of light and dark imagery, it is mentioned that shorter and shorter now the twilight clips, the days as though the sunset gates they crowd. As one progresses from the cradle to the grave, and as seasons pass from spring to autumn, there is a literal loss of light. With each and every passing day, the seasons as well as the individual's life force grows more dim. So here's what my students do, all right? I'm going to break this down. I call it the 5-word rule, which is sort of like a template within a template. Before my students quote, I tell them to place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote small. It keeps the quote conversational, right? I don't want to hear quote dumps, and I don't want to hear abrupt transitions. So very silky smooth quote transitions. And my students came back and said because of the language of this poem, it didn't, like, their quote transitions didn't sound fantastic. And in reading their essays today, I agree. This is a hard poem to quote and make those transitions sound silky smooth. But this kid did a fair job of that. So then you quote, you got to analyze it, right? You got to analyze the juxtaposition of the light and dark imagery. And the student did that just fine. So let's keep rolling here. But just like most of mankind himself, The seasons of lightness likewise throw up resistance to change, especially when they save by fits the warmer air deceives, and stealing hopeful to some sheltered bower, she lies on pillows of the yellow leaves and tries the old tunes over for an hour. All right, quote, analyze. So look at this. Immediately unpack that quote. The old tunes are the melodies of spring, a time of young and vibrant life that is merely a memory once the autumn of one's life settles in. And this is the thing. The seasons likewise have memory and want to hold on to the light of happier days. So this student's doing a nice job of playing with that light-dark binary, but also tying in the personification, which is what they promise. So all of the quotes and paraphrases thus far are perfect. And that's one of the things that my templates help students do, is to quote with deliberation. So sometimes when I read College Board papers, the quotes just seem kind of willy-nilly, or they paraphrase too much, or they're taking big block quotes, and it's not skillful. I think it definitely precludes kids from getting the sophistication point. So let's see where they go from here. Man and nature steal these numbered days when they come to an end point, and just like the flowers themselves, man and rose will take off their tire of red. The mullein stalk its yellow stars have lost, and the proud meadow pink hangs down her head against earthly's chilly bosom, witched with frost. Just like this rose, man will endure the same fate and shed the spring's bountiful light. So you might be asking yourselves this, or saying to yourselves, this is kind of a long paragraph thus far. That was a big second premise. Indeed. So while my introductory paragraphs are 4 sentences long, body paragraphs that my students write tend to be 10 to 12 sentences. So I find that those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that kids often write, you're not going to get the support and the analysis you need in there to get the sophistication point. So I like it when my students argue a few terms up top in the first premise, and then go get all their quotes and paraphrases for those 2 or 3 things in the first premise and house it all within 10 to 12 sentences. But we're not done. We have to conclude the thought here. We still have to have the conclusion of the syllogism. Let's see what this student did. Typically, this takes 2 sentences, sometimes maybe 3 sentences, and it's a quick wrap back to the prompt and the thesis. So this student says, all of life is sealed to the singular fate, whether it be a blade of grass, a pesky bug, or a baby born yesterday. The 4 seasons will trace a finger along the lines of the passage of time, and invariably all life will return to darkness. So it's that simple, right? So that was very, very cogent. The line of reasoning stayed perfectly intact. So what I would do is, if you're hosting a writing workshop with your kids, if you're showing them this video, I'd pause right here and have them practice the first premise, go get their quotes, and then have them tackle the whole syllogism bit by bit. So the next question is this, because you got to write more than just one body paragraph. What do I do next? And it's an easy answer. You bust out another syllogism. For real, that's all you got to do. So switch up your lit terms. Since we're going chronologically sequentially, we still have the middle of the poem left to analyze. And then we have that very poignant ending, which we haven't even touched yet. So that's going to come in the second body paragraph. And I often get asked by teachers, how many body paragraphs do my students write on the AP exam? For lit and lang, each of the FRQs, my students do 4 paragraphs. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. And I feel that's all they need. So that's typically about a page and 3/4 if you're doing 10 to 12 sentence body paragraphs. And it's perfect. They can house everything that they need to in the in 4 paragraphs. So I never do 5 paragraphs with my students. Always 4. Intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. All right, so how do we wrap this essay up? We got to throw a conclusion on it. And I know that there are many YouTube legends out there in the composition world that have templates for conclusions. And I don't think there's any secret way to write a conclusion. A conclusion is a conclusion. So let me show you a couple that my students wrote. I do have a lot of sentence stems that I use with my students for conclusions, but for the sake of time and simplicity, I'm just going to show you how they do it. So typically my students will take 3 or 4 sentences, and it's a heavy thematic focus in the conclusion paragraph. So let's conclude this essay that we've been seeing so far. This is what this student did. Entrenched into the DNA of every living thing are the seasons. No matter what it is, the 4 seasons will literally and figuratively touch the course of every living path, all the way until the final speck of life gets snuffed out. But for as long as there's life, most of nature will hold strong to the lighter, warmer days. So even in focusing on the thematic stuff here, this student is really focused on that juxtaposition of the light and dark imagery and the idea that the seasons are personified. And they didn't have to, regurgitate the terms and, restate the terms to devices techniques. It's just a heavy umbrella thematic concept. So just to solidify this, let's try it again and take a look at one more conclusion paragraph. This student used one of my sentence stems. For whatever the reason, I like in a global sense, comma. And a lot of my students will end their essays this way, in a global sense, comma, and then boom, just finish it. So that's what this student did on the exam. In a global sense, the passage of life is analogous to the passage of the 4 seasons. From spring to summer, from autumn to winter, life's natural course is to lose the light of life. In spite of this shared fate, however, man's natural impulse is to preserve the light for as long as possible. All right, so that takes us to the end here. So I hope this serves you well and gives you a sense of how my students pulled the strings of my template from beginning to end on this particular FRQ1. Now, my students will do this for all of the FRQs, and in forthcoming videos, I'll show you the entire 2023 exam. So I'll make a video for FRQ2 and FRQ3, but for now, happy teaching, happy writing. I hope this serves you well. And just to wrap things up, let me give you my contact information and a little bit of information about my professional development offerings. So as you may know, I am a lead teacher with the National Writing Project. We work together all calendar year long, and we offer a slew of professional developments. This summer, in fact, we're going to be offering an AP English FRQ boot camp. So I'm going to do one for Lang and Lit, where over the course of 6 hours, 2-hour pops, we're going to go over each FRQ, and I'll show teachers how to equip their students with my templates, my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, all the tricks of the trade. And so that'll be coming up. If you want more information on that, you can visit my webpage at www.teachingwritingcoach.com. The National Writing Project and I also have a self-paced course, which is full on, everything with my templates, my alternative grading methods, etc. And we also do something called the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind throughout the academic year. So you can check out that website at teachingwritingcoach.com. If you want to reach out to me, have any questions, feel free to drop me a line at my Gmail, which is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So that is it for now. Be well, and as always, happy teaching, happy writing.